Mike was one of those personality plus kind of guys, always at the centre of a group or conversation. He seemed to have no obvious flaws in his character, no gaps in his personality. He always had something good to say, wise or funny or both. He married and moved overseas, and we lost touch. The next thing I heard of him was that he'd been killed tragically and senselessly in a car accident on a German autobahn. This world is very far from the life and peace for which God made it. It may be that that has touched you directly and personally. It may be that mercifully that's not been the case yet, but it will. Either way, whether close or far away, you don't have to watch the news often to know that this is a world very far from the life and peace that God made it for. This session we're going to take a look where often the temptation is to shut our eyes and to bury our heads, to look at the problem of this world, the problem of sin and evil, try and understand it at depth so that we're better placed to understand the solution that God has provided for it in Jesus of Nazareth. God made the world healthy. We saw that last time. God made it healthy. But a terrible, terrible disease has come in and afflicted and corrupted and betrayed this world and destroyed its health. The essence of health we saw last time was being rightly related to God. To put God at the centre as the one who is worthy of your worship and honour, to live for Him as your creator and sustainer, and therefore to be rightly ordered in relationship with all other things and other people as well, to honour and to recognise the dignity that they too have as creatures of God. If health is constituted by right relationships, it makes sense to understand sin and disease as constituted by wrongly ordered relationships. Sin, understood according to the Bible, is that sense of wrong relationship where the centre of your life is taken away from God and replaced by something else, where God is shifted sideways and something else is put in His place. Now, the Bible is aware of two fundamental alternatives to God. The first one is ourselves, and the Bible calls this sin pride. At one level that makes sense, doesn't it? If you're going to move God out of the way, then you might as well put in the next most valuable thing, the next thing full of dignity, and that's yourself. Now, sometimes we're aware of pride in a kind of surface way. Listen to this ad that I found in a book recently in the personal section. Strikingly beautiful, Ivy League graduate, playful, passionate, perceptive, elegant, bright, articulate, original in mind, unique in spirit. I possess a rare balance of beauty and depth, sophistication and earthiness, seriousness and a love of fun. Professionally successful, perfectly capable of being self-sufficient and independent, but I won't be truly content until we find each other. Please reply with a substantial letter describing your background and who you are. Photo essential. Sometimes we see pride at a surface and obvious level like that and we can laugh. But pride is deeply rooted in all of us. It's that which drives out love. It finds itself and expresses itself in a resort to violence when we want to get our own way, in a resort to deception when we find that convenient, in a resort to skin colour or sexual orientation when we want to hate someone. Pride is all too prevalent in our world, and it is one form of the essence of sin, of disordered relationships. The other kind of disorder we can have in relationships, the other kind of replacement that we can make for God, is not so much ourselves, but for something else, someone else. That we put someone or something else in the place of God. The Bible calls this a sin of idolatry. It's giving to something, some cause, some project, perhaps some person, that which should only be given to God. Again, we can laugh perhaps at the idolatry in a very primitive form that we see amongst traditional peoples in their totem poles and so on. But you don't have to look too far or too deep to see idolatry in modern forms in our own world. The idolatry of careerism, the idolatry of wealth, the idolatry of the home, sometimes even the idolatry of the family, that for which we find the very person, very reason for our existence. Sin of pride, the sin of idolatry. These two things constitute the terrible disease that has infected God's world, that has taken away the health for which He created it. They affect us in two different ways. On the one hand, we can be agents of this sin, perpetrators. We find in ourselves, from the inside, the capacity to hurt others, to strike out, to damage and to break. But at the same time, we also experience sin from the outside as victims, those who are sinned against. Often we call this evil when we're sinned against. It can be a natural evil, such as tsunami or earthquake. It can be a personal evil when someone else wants to interfere with us. From the outside and from the inside, each of us is affected by this sin. I think the situation that this represents and corresponds to most closely is that of the addict, the person who's a substance abuser. It's interesting talking to addicts. You often get a sense from them both that they have chosen the path that they've gone down, that they're responsible and they know that. In fact, to take away that responsibility is to take away their humanity. But at the same time, there's a sense in which addicts feel themselves victims of a terrible power, a power which grabs them and controls them, that forces them to do things that they wouldn't otherwise choose to do. And it's this dual nature of addiction as both agent and responsible perpetrator and at the same time victim of a terrible power. This dual nature of addiction that corresponds to our dual situation under sin, afflicted from inside, affected from outside. Understanding sin in this way has three very important consequences. Firstly, it means that help really can only come from the outside. It can only come from outside ourselves, because if we're affected at the very level of our DNA by this sin, it means that even our best efforts in education, in political reform, in social activity, even our best efforts will be tainted by sin. And you see that in the world, don't you? So often, even the great movements are tainted by terrible infighting. Secondly, it means that God still loves us, even in our sin, because sin is an intruder. We still bear the imprint of God's creative power in our lives. And God is determined not to allow sin to define us. He hasn't turned his back on us. Thirdly, if sin is the opposite of God, if sin is replacing God by something or someone else, ourselves or something outside ourselves, then it makes sense to think that sin's consequence is the opposite of God's intention for us. God's purpose for the world was life and peace. The consequence of sin, as we see far too often around us, is death and conflict. Whether you look at the news or whether you look at your own life, you don't have to look very hard to see death and conflict abound, precisely because sin abounds. You've got to ask yourself the question, so what? What difference does this understanding make? Well, the question that puts to everyone is this: will you see yourself as a sinner? That's not a word we use often, and it's not a word we should use lightly, but it's a word that's appropriately used when we understand the nature of sin, this virus which has infected God's world. Will you see yourself as part of the problem more than you are part of the solution? Will you look to God for help? For you see, God is still committed. God has acted decisively and powerfully and wonderfully in the person of his own Son, Jesus of Nazareth. That's what we're going to look at next session.